Well, good evening and Merry Christmas, friends. It is so good to be with you all. In case we haven't met, my name is JT. I'm the executive pastor here at The Well, and we are so glad you decided to take some time out of your Christmas Eve and come spend some time with us. It takes a lot of bravery, a lot of courage to come into a church for the first time, especially on a day like Christmas Eve, so we're really, really thankful that you're with us. And if this is your first time, we would love to point out these QR codes you'll see up on the screen behind me or on the wall to your left or to the right of the stage. If you scan that with your phone, it opens up to a bunch of links. One of those is a digital Connect card. Gives us the opportunity to reach out to you, say thanks for being here, get to know you a little bit, and talk about how you already fit into what we're doing here at The Well. And there's also a link in there to partner with us in the act of financial generosity. Here on Christmas Eve, all of the money we collect tonight is going toward mission work, and half of what we collect is going to Mozambique to work toward building wells and safe water in Africa, and the other half stays here locally in our mission of being a welcoming and inclusive church community in Weldon Spring. And also, on that note, if you fill out a Connect card, either a digital Connect card through the QR code or back by the I'm New sign, there are some physical ones. For every Connect card that's filled out tonight, $10 is being donated by a family in our church to go directly to safe water work in Mozambique. So if this is your first time with us, or if you've been with us before but never filled out a Connect card, tonight's a great night to do that and get that money donated over to safe water in Mozambique. But again, so good to be with you. Pastor Danny's going to come up and share our message here in a moment, but we have a quick video to get us ready for that, so take a look.
In those days, Caesar Augustus declared that everyone throughout the empire should be enrolled in the tax lists. This first enrollment occurred when Quirinius governed Syria. Everyone went to their own cities to be enrolled. Since Joseph belonged to David's house and family line, he went up from the city of Nazareth in Galilee to David's city, called Bethlehem, in Judea. He went to be enrolled there together with Mary, who was promised to him in marriage and who was pregnant. While they were there, the time came for Mary to have her baby. She gave birth to her firstborn child, a son, wrapped him snugly and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the guest room.
The Lord's angel stood before them. The Lord's glory shone around them, and they were terrified. The angel said, "Don't be afraid. Look, I bring good news to you. Wonderful, joyous news for all people. Your Savior is born today in David's city. He is Christ, the Lord. This is a sign for you. You will find a newborn baby, wrapped snugly and lying in a manger." Suddenly, a great assembly of the heavenly forces was with the angel praising God. They said, "Glory to God in heaven, and on earth, peace among those whom he favors."
Well, good evening and welcome to The Well. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, as JT said, my name is Danny. I'm one of the pastors here at our church, and I'm just glad and excited that you're here, that you're in worship with us. As he said, it takes a lot of courage to come to try a new church on Christmas Eve or any day. Also, some of you I know were invited. Some of you came on your own. Some of you were drugged by a family member. We appreciate all of that, and are just glad that you're here and that you're in worship with us this evening. And as we were getting ready for the Christmas season, something that often pops into my mind is gifts. We think about the gifts that we give and the gifts that we receive. And I began to think about what is the most memorable gift receiving experience that I've ever had. And you think about the gifts under the tree, right? And what are the things that stood out to you, the memorable moments. And I immediately went back to my 20s. I came home from college and I went to spend time with my family. And all I wanted that year was one gift. I dropped every hint to my parents. I sent them text messages. I sent them emails. I left sticky notes around their house. I would drop it in conversation. I said, there's this only one thing that I want. And if I get it, I will have arrived as a person. My life will be transformed. I will become the person that God always wanted me to be. And if I finally get these Beats by Dre headphones, my life will be radically transformed. And so if you ever looked under the tree, you see the boxes, right? And I looked around, I'm like, that looks like a Beats by Dre size box. And so I'd imagine, like, I bet they got it for me. But what if they didn't put it in the right size box, right? What if they did the whole Inception thing, like a box within a box, and they're trying to like trick me? And so like it could be in this really big one. What if they went unorthodox but useful, the bag route? Like what if they went that way? Like what if it's in there? And I began to like imagine and expect and want in this gift that I just asked for. There were no uncertain terms. This was the only thing I was interested in getting this year, and I asked for it. And Christmas Day came, and we were opening gifts, and we get through them, and it's not at the beginning, and it's not at the middle, and we get to the end, and I open in the last gift, and there's no Beats by Dre headphones. I was devastated. The look on your face, right? Like you have to have the smile, right? You're like, oh man, I'm so happy for all this stuff. None of which I remember. I still remember not getting the Beats, and I open and I look, but then out of nowhere, my mom comes with a gift around the corner. And I'm like, this is it. The Lord has come. This is the day that he made. The Beats by Dre headphones are going to come around the corner, and it's in a bag, and I'm like ripping the paper out of it, and I pull out what I can only describe to you as a dollar store pair of earmuff headphones. And like not like a lot of us are in this world now where it's like you don't even know. These were like wired headphones that like I would plug into my MP3 player, right? Like it was a ugly, to say it nicely, but unexpected gift. And if you ever received one of those gifts, right, you're like, you have to smile, right? You're like, this big smile on your face, like, I'm really excited about this, right? And trying to make sure my mom and dad aren't like devastated, but it was not at all what I expected, not at all what I asked for, not at all what I wanted. And as I was thinking about like that as it relates to the Christmas story, like the Christmas story, when I became to know like the story of Jesus and became a part of this whole part of faith, I had this idea that the Christmas story was really immediate. Like everyone knew about it, it had happened, Jesus was born, and the whole world was psyched about it, and it transformed everyone's lives and stories and all of this kind of stuff. But the more I read and the more I studied and the more I found out as I dove into the story myself, like that wasn't exactly how the Christmas story went. Like if you go back into the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, back in the first book of the Bible in Genesis, God tells this guy named Abraham, who's the father of God's people Israel, this nation of people that are striving after God's heart. He says that you're not just going to be a blessed nation, but you're going to have more descendants than the stars in the sky and the sands on the beach. They're going to multiply and they're going to extend, and you're not just going to be a blessing to yourself, but you're going to be a blessing to the world. And they heard this and they were excited about this, right? They were excited about this prospect of this gift that God was giving them. And they got to build expectations and hopes and ideas about that. But as we do, like as we expect things and we anticipate things, we get excited about them. But if you've ever waited more than a day for something, like as you wait and it doesn't come, you start to grow anxious and you start to wonder and you start to shift your perception of what this gift is going to look like and if it's ever going to come. And for God's people, this nation of Israel, the gift of Jesus, this Messiah, did not immediately come. They went through this time of oppression and this time of slavery, this time of wandering, this time of great depression and sadness, and they were still wondering, like, is God's gift, this thing that God had promised us, is that ever actually going to come to fruition? Is this gift ever going to be realized? Is this thing ever going to come true? And then God speaks to God's people through these people called the prophets in the Old Testament. One of them's name is Isaiah. It's one of the places we get like the Christmas prophecy for. Sometimes they read that in the Old Testament as we get ready for Christmas Eve. But in there's this kind of reminder that God gives God people. He says, well, you actually are still going to be this blessed nation. And eventually you're going to have these descendants and they're going to spread throughout the world and you're going to have more and you're going to be a blessing not just to yourself, but to the world. But then also he says that even though you've been beat down, you've been kicked, and you've been in slavery, and you've wandered, and you've been oppressed, one day that's not going to be your story. That one day that the world's governments and the world's empires and all the principalities and powers in the world will rest on your Messiah's shoulders. And for them, people that have been subjugated and oppressed and in slavery, and remember this promise that they would one day be blessed, they imagine, like, what would this life look like where the fulfillment of this promise came through? But from those words in Isaiah to the story that we just read on the screen in the video in Luke chapter 2 of the Christmas story, there were not 1 year or 2 years or 10 decades. There were 400 years of waiting and anticipation for this Messiah to come. And again, if you've ever waited for something, like you imagine the story was passed down from generation, like fathers told their sons and mothers told their daughters and grandparents told their grandkids, and this story was getting passed along. And if you've ever like we're all going to be with our family here for Christmas Eve and Christmas, and maybe you're already doing this, and you sit around the table for the meal, and like the crazy uncle or the crazy grandpa tells that old story, and you're like, yeah, that's not a real story, right? That's probably how they imagine this promise, right? They're like, that's just crazy old Uncle Hezekiah talking about the gift that's going to come, right? That's never actually going to happen. And they waited and they waited and they anticipated and they hoped. And they dreamed and they imagined what this was going to look like. But again, because they were oppressed, their vision for what this gift would look like started to shift. Like initially they imagined, like they heard that promise that God gave Abraham, that they weren't just going to be a blessed nation, but they really as a nation, you can find this as you read about the story in Genesis and early on in the Bible, they embraced this part of the promise that said they would be a blessing to the rest of the world. They really took that seriously. They wanted not just to be a blessing themselves, but they wanted to bless the rest of the world. But as we often do, as our circumstances change and we get in these places of hardship, they became less interested in this idea of blessing other people. And they're like, we just kind of want to get ours. Like we've been in pretty dire circumstances. And they began to imagine what this promise of a Messiah might look like. And they began to get this idea in their mind that it would look like this king on a throne that would ride in on a horse with a sword that would overthrow political empires and put them back into a place of prominence that would be powerful and bold and outspoken and articulate and galvanize people to come around them. And what's interesting about the Christmas story is that's not at all what Jesus's entry into the world looked like. Like Jesus did not come in a castle on a throne, but came rather in a manger, in a cave in the middle of a nowhere town in a nowhere city, born to an unwed teenage nobody girl in this community that did not expect anything really good to come out of it. It wasn't on a throne, and it wasn't in a king, and it wasn't in a power, in a place of prestige, but a place of meekness and humbleness, that the Messiah, that Jesus came into the world, which again makes sense. Like if you ever read the Christmas story, like there are certain people that we see, like if you saw the nativity in the video or you have one in your house, like who do you put around it, right? You have Mary and you have Joseph. Some people have like Zechariah and Elizabeth. There's a little baby in the manger. There's probably some wise men. And like that's all, right? It's not like there was this massive crowd of people that were super psyched about the arrival of Jesus. Actually, it was the opposite. Like King Herod was a political leader, and he heard about this idea that there would be a king coming into the world. And he's like, well, I heard it's going to come in the form of a baby, and we should probably get rid of this baby. Like we need to take him out so he doesn't take my place as king. And so this idea that there was this immediacy of this grabbing onto the story of Jesus coming into the world, that's not exactly how it is. Like we gather together, and this is our fourth Christmas Eve service, and we've had several hundred people gather together over the course of these services to gather together around the story of good news. But that wasn't exactly how the story went in the first century time. They wondered, and their eyes were fixed on what they hoped and expected and desired this entry of the Messiah to look like, what they wanted it to look like, not necessarily what they needed it to look like. And thinking back to my headphones, these affectionately, I called my mom about this earlier this week, and I called her, and we affectionately refer to them in my house as the Muffs by Dre, is what we call them. And we laughed for a good 30 minutes when I talked to my mom on the phone about this week. And we had talked about it. And I loathed these gifts. I was not that excited about them. But what was interesting is like I went back to college and I packed them up in my bag and I went back to my school. And I remember like I went to college in Oregon and it was a rainy day and it was cold. And I was like, well, I kind of want to go on a run. So I'm looking around for headphones. I was like, I guess the Muffs by Dre could work. So I throw them on and I go on my run. And then one day I was like going to class and I was like, well, it's kind of chilly out. I guess I could put my muffs on. And I went to class and I went and did this. And what's funny about this thing, I did not want these at all, but they ended up being something that I needed. Like these survived all of college. These survived a move across the country. They've survived several relationships. Like these things have been with me through the thick and the thin of my life. These have been with me. And they have been like these amazing sidekicks. And Rob and I were just talking. He was like, I was waiting for you to pull out these busted headphones. They do not exist anymore. They have been thrown away at some point. But what was interesting is I did not imagine these would be something that would serve me any function. They would give me any sort of value add to my life. They were for certain not what I wanted, but they ended up being a gift from my parents that laughable, and it's given us memories and great conversations, but actually quite a functional need was met as I got these gifts. And when I think about the entry of Jesus into the world, again, it was not at all how they imagined, how they wanted, and how they hoped the entry of God coming to dwell among them would look like. Like God was always near them in spirit, but this was a tangible expression of God coming and dwelling among them. But there wasn't an immediacy for it. It's a reason that Jesus grew over the course of 30 years, and we only see 4 gospels about his story and nothing about his teens and his 20s and his angsty years as he's building up to this ministry that we know now. That when he has his followers, there's only 12 of them that walk around with him, one of which will eventually betray him, right? And it's not even a group of A-list people that are following them. They're all these kind of B-list people that are around him. And even after his death and resurrection, it goes from like 11 people on a mountaintop to 120. And then slowly it builds traction and God's people start to grab a hold of this promise that they're hearing. And I imagine, like, I often like to put myself in the shoes of other people and say, like, well, what was the reason that they missed this? And I think that it was they were hoping that ultimately in the coming of God to dwell among God's people, that God would radically and tangibly change their circumstances. Like, that's what they were looking for. They wanted someone that would radically and substantially change their circumstances in tangible ways that they could measure. Again, like they were people that were oppressed and kicked out. They were oppressed by Pharaoh in the Old Testament and by the Roman government in Jesus's time. They were expecting someone that was going to overthrow powers, going to conquer empires, going to raise them up from a place where they were beat down to a place of prominence. And they imagined that Jesus would conquer the sorts of things they wanted Jesus to conquer. And so they wanted this radical change and this tangible change of circumstances. But what Jesus did conquer was he conquered things like sin and death and brokenness. He didn't conquer the things that they would imagine that he would conquer, but he conquered the divide between us and God and the things that threaten to tear us apart from God and from one another. But that didn't like have this tangible circumstance shifting vision that they imagined for what Jesus' entry into the world would look like. And when I think about like what the hope of the Christmas story could and should and might be for us is that many of us come into spaces like this, and this is a wonderful, beautiful day of great joy. Like I love this day, getting to come together and to worship and doing all of these services and seeing familiar faces and new faces and getting to rally around the same story. I love that kind of thing. But what I love more than that is watching the way that the Christmas story transforms not always the circumstances of people, but almost always certainly transforms the hearts of people as we allow it to. And this is like kind of a hot take as a pastor. It's not like probably the most pastoral thing I've ever said up here, but I really do enjoy Christmas Eve. But preaching on Christmas Eve, I can like take or leave it. Like I don't necessarily, like I'm kind of the person that likes like new stories and fresh things, right? Like I want to look at new things. And as long as I've been a Christian and been a pastor and preaching, the Christmas story, to my knowledge, has not changed. There's been this entry of this baby born in a manger, and we're usually preaching out of the story in Luke 2. And I kind of always hope that the circumstances of this story can change. And I've tried to reverse engineer it and re-engineer it in different ways to find it. And I've not ever been able to find it. But every single year, even before I was a pastor, and certainly as a pastor, as I've dove into this story and I've reread the story in Luke, every single year, even though it doesn't circumstantially change, it does change my heart's perception of the story every single time I read it. Like I pull something new out of it every single year. When I think about what the promise and the hope of the Christmas story is, it is not that the Christmas story is about changing our circumstances, but it is about the Christmas story radically finding ways to transform and change our hearts. And if I was going to offer you like a word of encouragement and a word of challenge this Christmas is to challenge yourself to say like, what would it look like for me? And maybe I'm in the best circumstances or the worst circumstances. Maybe I'm somewhere in between. And I do fervently and wholeheartedly believe in a God of miracles and a God of miraculous things and a God of breakthrough that can do anything that God is willing to do. But I also know that sometimes God does not change our circumstances, even if we are hoping that they would radically change. That's certainly true in the Christmas story, right? That the circumstances did not immediately change. But what happened in the Christmas story is Jesus came to dwell among these people in the meekness of this baby. Like the hearts of individuals around, this ripple effect of transformation started to happen as people's circumstances were not immediately changed, but their hearts were continually transformed to see the goodness of the gift that God had in front of them, the gift that God was revealing, the gift that maybe they missed because it didn't look the way they imagined it would. It looked more like Muffs by Dre and less like Beats by Dre. But they began to let the goodness of the story transform their hearts and to see the things God was doing, even if it didn't look the way that they hoped or wished or imagined it would, but it might have looked the way that they needed it to look. And so my hope for us this Christmas season is we head out of this place, like maybe some of you tonight will hang out with your family. Maybe tomorrow you'll get a chance to hang out with friends and family. A time of, I think, great fun, but also a time of great anxiety. Sometimes frustration, sometimes fear as we come into that. Hopefully a lot of joy in that. Sometimes we're like, man, I wish my circumstances would change. Maybe it's the first time without a loved one. Maybe it's the first time after a broken relationship. Maybe it's the first time you're celebrating a story that looks different and then not the way that you hoped or imagined that it would look. And my hope and prayer would be that we do follow a God of miraculous things, and that God, if God could and was possible, that your circumstances might be able to be shifted in tangible, real-life ways. But my greater prayer would be that in the midst of circumstances that sometimes look frustrating, sometimes look unwinnable, sometimes look nothing like we hoped or imagined they would, that we would open ourselves up in this season to allow the light of Christ and the story that God has to penetrate our hearts and begin to transform it, even if our circumstances don't immediately change. That we would allow the story of light bursting forth into the darkness, a world that looks dark and looks painful, but that the light of God and the light of Christ would fill the space and permeate within us, and then we might be able to share that with us, that as our stories are transformed, as our hearts are transformed, the lives of others and the hearts of others are transformed as well. That's my greatest hope and prayer for us, that as we leave this space, this would be a beacon of light that leaves forth from this. As it's physically dark outside, that we would light up the space as we go, as hope fills us and we share that with other people. So with that in mind, friends, would you join me in a word of prayer? God, I do know that it's with a mixed and myriad of emotions that we fill this space, not just in this service, but in all the services we've done. We all bring in unique stories and emotions and feelings, expectations and hopes for ways you would show up and ways we wish you would have showed up, ways that we hope you will in the future. And God, I just ask that in the waiting and the anticipation, that our eyes and our vision could be fixed on you. That as we wait for circumstances to bend towards the hope and the justice and the peace and the inclusion that you have and have offered and promised us, that in the midst of that waiting for those circumstances to change, God, that you would tangibly and wholeheartedly change our hearts to be able to grasp a hold of the hope and the peace, the joy and the love that you offer each and every one of us, not just during the Christmas season, but every single day, every single hour, every single moment and breath that we take. And so, God, as we continue to worship through song and through word, we just ask that you would transform our hearts, that you would meet us here as we sing, as we respond, as we worship, as we bring all of who we are to this space. And so, God, be with us as we prepare our hearts for communion, as we continue to sing. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.